Okay. So can everyone hear me? Can you put your thumbs up? Brilliant. Okay. So I might as well start. There's no point hanging around. Hopefully most people will manage to get here all right. So today what I'm going to talk about really is well, I'm going to concentrate on the fluids in our body in particular, and the myriad sort of ingenious ways that our bodies use fluid to do all the various sort of bodily functions, and how we can promote our own natural pumps and squeezes that are built into our structure and to help keep that fluid circulating. So there's loads of, sort of self-help techniques. I mean, obviously there's lifestyle changes as well, but coming from an osteopathic perspective as well, I'm going to just mention some of the things that we use to try and move fluid within our body. I don't know if this is going to work actually. We went down to the what's it called, the pier the other day, and the starlings are doing this incredible murmuration thing at the moment, and it just looks so fluid, doesn't it? It's incredible. Anyway, so let's crack on. So just a little bit slightly boring stuff to start with really is just going to focus and think about what is a fluid exactly, and why are fluids themselves interesting? Why does our world use fluid? Why do all biological creatures use fluid? Basically, what is it about fluids that make them special? And I think the thing that I want to concentrate on is that fluids by definition flow, and movement is that defining feature of them. So fluids can carry, their little particles carry energy, and they can transfer that energy from place to place. So liquids and gases are examples of fluid because they can flow. And generally, when fluids lose that energy, their movement slows down, and then they can become more solid. And to make them liquid again and make them move again, you need to give that energy back at them. So, for example, if you heat a solid, lots of times it will melt and turn into a liquid and start to flow. If you heat it even more, it will start to, you'll give those particles even more energy and they can move about even more, and it will become a gas or vapor. And when they're gases and vapors, the particles are so far spread apart that you can compress them back down into a liquid using very high pressure, whereas liquids are sort of closer to solids in their structure, in their sort of closeness together of the particles, and therefore liquids generally are fluids that are not compressible. And these particular characteristics of fluids are really useful features and give them all the useful properties that we use in our bodies. So as I said, we're finding fluids pretty much everywhere in life. They've just landed a thing on Mars, haven't they, in the middle of a lake, because they reckon that that's the most likely place that they're going to find life, because there's been water there, and we know that water and fluid is compatible with life. So what are some of those useful properties? Well, generally fluids will fill their container, and they can take on any shape. So that's quite a good thing, because it means that they are easy to channel, and they will fill up spaces. It also means that we've got to solve some problems, like if there's a hole in the container. So if you puncture a blood vessel, for example, our fluid will flow out, the blood will flow out. So you have to have mechanisms to plug holes and keep the container walls solid. Because liquids aren't compressible, they can give us structure. So that's a really useful thing that we use a lot in our bodies. An example of that in the rest of the world is, for example, if you think about a can of Coke, when it's shut, you can stand on a can of Coke and the liquid inside it stops it compressing. But as soon as you've drunk that Coke, you can compress that can. It doesn't really have any structural integrity at all. It's the non-compressibility of the liquid that gives it its form. The other thing that is really good with liquids is that they can mix with other substances really easily, because and carry those other substances about. So they're useful for transport. They're useful to carry energy around. So they're useful to transport heat from one place to another. And our body uses that loads. And because the particles are constantly moving around, they're constantly exposing new surfaces for chemical reactions. So unlike, for example, a lump of copper or lead, where often it's just the surface that gets tarnished, a liquid, because it's constantly moving, will generally complete its chemical reaction. So it's very useful as part of metabolism as well. I have to remember which bit I pressed to. Okay, so this could be interesting. I'm not quite sure whether it's actually going to work. Let's try and think of as many fluids in the human body as we can. I think to do this, I'm going to have to try and somehow unmute everyone. Or maybe we should do this on the chat. Chat. Oh dear, this is going to be quite complicated. Sorry, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Danny, can you help me? I can't even see the chat page anymore because I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so sorry, technical hitch because of my, oh, here we go. No, I can't see this. Okay, sorry, technical hitch. Okay, so I'm going to try and write in here some of the different types of fluid that we come across in the body. I was hoping to do this as more of an interactive thing. So maybe think in your own heads. Let's start with some of the fluids in our body that we use for transport, for example. So the obvious ones that I can think of are is blood. Oh, are you seeing that? That's exciting. Blood. Another one that some of you might not be so familiar with is lymph, which is carries tissue fluid back into the blood that's collected in the tissues. So I'm going to classify lymph as another transport fluid. I can see that I should be able to see a chat thing, but I can't bring it up for some reason. Chat. Oh, there we go. Fluid behind, oh, brilliant. I can see blood, lymph. Okay, so we've got some excellent ones coming up here. There's some which I would classify as secretions or excretions, like tears. No, sorry. Oh, that's gone wrong. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm having technical failures here. Okay, so we've got blood. People have mentioned things like lymph, synovial fluid. That's another really great one. That I would put under sort of functional fluids or structural fluids. We've got tears and sweat and urine, blood, sweat and tears, yeah. Those I would put under sort of secretions or excretions. Adrenaline, that's an interesting one because that's a hormone, and yes, it is a liquid. I think, well, it's a chemical. It will be dissolved into the blood. Mucus, yeah, that's another great one. Vaginal fluid, absolutely. What about things like so semen? Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these fluids, if you think about them, are water-based. CSF, yes, cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that bathes the brain. Sebum, thank you. Somebody has come up with a one that is not necessarily water-based, so more waxy or oily fluid that we have. And there's a few others. Earwax, for example, is another one that is not water-based. But there's, if you look at them on the whole, most of these fluids that people have mentioned are basically water-based ones. There's another little one here. I'm going to try and play this video. This video, I think it's quite interesting. It's actually an ultrasound of an embryo. And embryos, as you know, are bathed in amniotic fluid. And amniotic fluid is a really interesting one. It's going to provide buoyancy and protection to the baby. But to start with, it is secreted by maternal tissues surrounding the baby. But as gestation goes on, it's actually the baby that produces the amniotic fluid through urine. And you can see here, I don't know if you can see my little cursor. You can see here, this is a male fetus, this is its bottom, and there's testicles and a little penis here. And if I press play, you can see that actually you can see it peeing. Oops. You can see this little embryo having a little pee. And most of the amniotic fluid in the end is produced by the baby itself. And the baby swallowing and drinking the amniotic fluid helps the digestive system, the kidneys to develop and start to work. So the amniotic fluid has various different functions, which change as the gestation progresses. So I'm just going to go back a slide if I can. So thinking about some of those fluids that we talked about before, my argument today really is that it's fluid movement in particular that's essential for most of these useful functions that fluid has in our bodies. And that stagnation or blockage of that movement is when a lot of our ill health arises. So, for example, if we look at our COVID sufferers, the critically ill ones, one of the features of that illness is when the blood starts to coagulate and become sticky, and then it doesn't flow through the little vessels quite so well, the capillary vessels so well, and then the organs that they supply, the vessels supply, start to die off. And that's when we get this really sort of critical whole body shutdown. But it's really when the coagulation starts that people get into real trouble. We also see other problems when flow gets blocked. So think of things like gallstones blocking the bile duct, and then the buildup of bile that happens, and the back flow into the liver and the blood system, causing jaundice and things. Glaucoma is a blockage of the drainage of the fluid in the eye. Somebody mentioned the fluid behind the eye, so they probably know about that. Lymph, when lymph isn't drained away from the body tissues, it builds up within the body, and you get these very swollen arms or legs which become very painful. And then also we've got lots of those fluids that you mentioned are lubricating fluids or nourishing fluids. So they protect, allow gliding and sliding of adjacent surfaces, and also nourishing of surfaces that don't necessarily have a blood supply. So examples of that would be cornea of the eye. If we didn't have tears, the cornea would dry out and we'd go blind. Our joints have synovial fluid in them, and when that isn't lubricating the cartilage dies. And another example would be when the linings of our lungs and our guts and our heart, so they're called serous membranes, become sticky with infection. We get things like pleurisy or peritonitis. And really, when you look at a lot of ancient medical practices and principles, and a lot of not so ancient medical practices and principles, we learn that movement seems common across the board as a sort of key to improving health. So I'm going to focus on how we can get as many of those fluids that we talked about now. We've made a nice long list of them all. And I'm going to go through these now and talk about how the different ways of getting them to move, focusing a little bit on some of the osteopathic techniques that we use, but also a lot of other lifestyle things that we can do too. You'll notice that most of these fluids that we came up with, we can sort of group them by transport or structure or secretions, but we can also look at what they're based on. And as I pointed out before, most of them are based on water. So water makes up about 60% of our body, and 2/3 of that water in our body is locked up inside the cells themselves. So it's within the little fatty membrane walls of our cells. And these little sort of fatty bubbles can control water movement in and out through special pores. It's quite complex physiology, and that's more the sort of realms of medicine, hormones, genes, local cellular situations that control how water moves in and out of cells. So I'm not really going to talk about that quite so much because I don't have enough knowledge or techniques at my disposal. It's complex physiology basically. But the rest of the water, 20% of it, is found bathing our cells or locked up in bladders or organs or part of our structure. And that's the bit that we can manipulate through conscious movement or physical therapies and things like that. So those are the ones I'm going to concentrate on now. So let's just have a little think about why water is so amazing. It's a little bit of sort of science to start with. Some of you might find this a little bit overwhelming, but basically you all know that water is H2O. That stands for a molecule that has one oxygen atom in it and 2 hydrogen atoms. And those atoms are very strongly bonded together, which means that water is quite stable as a substance. But if you are able to break that bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen molecules, you can release a lot of energy. So that breaking of that bond of bonds is hydrolysis. And that's quite useful for cellular reactions. So our bodies make use of that high energy bond in various ways, but I'm not really going to talk about that very much either. The other thing that is really interesting about water is that because of the nature of the molecules that make it up, the atoms that make it up, it's polarized. So it's like a little magnet. It has a minus and a plus end. So it's like it's got a sort of north and a south. And there are lots and lots of molecules in life, particularly biomolecules, that are also plus and minus. So things like sodium chloride, or straightforward salt, dissolves in water because sodium has a positive charge and chlorine has a negative charge. And loads and loads of really useful biomolecules are like that. And that's why your water is such a useful substance to dissolve things in. And that's why it's such a useful transport medium, because things dissolve in it really well. It also is attracted, the little molecules are attracted to each other because they line up like magnets do. So north and south, north and south, north and south, the positives are attracted to the negatives. And these little bonds, they're quite weak, but they make water sort of sticky. And that stickiness means that things like trees can draw water up from their roots, like miles and miles and miles up into the canopy through a thing called capillary action. And we also, lots of animals use surface tension to enable themselves to rest on the top of water. What else? The other thing that is really useful about these sort of magnetic bonds is that it means that water has a relatively low freezing point. So it becomes ice at a very low temperature relative to, for example, coconut oil, which you think about, you know, even recently our coconut oil has all been completely solid in the cupboard. Come the summer, it's all runny and liquid. And also it has a relatively high boiling point. So you can put lots and lots of heat into it before it starts turning into a gas. Like alcohol, for example, boils off very low temperature. And that means water is a really good heat sink, and it also, you can use it to transport heat around the body. So that's another massively useful function of it. The other thing that is useful about it is that it is attracted, because of its polarity, because of its sort of magnetism, it's attracted by salty meshes. And I'm going to talk about that in quite a lot of detail. Salty, as in sodium chloride, it has a charge, that's a polarized molecule, and so it attracts water. So if you leave a bowl of salt somewhere, it does eventually start to get very damp. And if you put a mesh of fibers in that as well, what we find is that water is attracted to these meshes, these salty meshes, and that forms a gel. And that gel is fantastic for structural support. And all sorts of organisms use that, from fungi through to bacteria to our bodies all over the place. We use these watery gels for support and protection as well. That turgidity creates structure and cushioning and all those sorts of things. I think that's everything I want to say. So water, that's brilliant. Let's just talk a little bit now about where we find that sort of free fluid, not the fluid that's locked up inside our cells that I was talking about before, the intracellular fluid, but more the fluid that we find in the spaces between cells, in the blood, in the secretions, in the CSF, the organs, the bladders, the joint cavities and all those sorts of things. Because those are the ones that are more accessible to us as osteopaths and as movement therapists and just as ordinary people, that we can actually manipulate ourselves. And I'm going to start with the most complicated one, which is the interstitial fluid. Okay, so here's a slightly crappy drawing of some cells, these green blobby things, suspended in a sort of fluid mesh. And I'm going to talk about the mesh a bit later. But almost all the cells in our body are very close to a capillary, a blood capillary, because that blood capillary is going to bring the oxygen and the nutrients that those cells need. And it's the red blood cells themselves that carry the oxygen. And when they reach an area that has low oxygen, they give that oxygen up, they give the gas up into the sort of oxygen deprived areas. Water and other things that are the small particles dissolved in the blood are actually forced through pressure through little holes in the walls of the capillary, and that's forced into the spaces between the cells. And you can see that with these little blue arrows. That's representing the water being pushed out by the blood pressure into that extracellular space. And once it's there, the cells can take up or put back what they don't need. They can take water up, they can take up the dissolved salts and hormones and things like that, and then they push out what they don't need. And the general sort of flow of fluid is towards these lymphatic ducts, also found in most tissues in the body, and that collects all these sort of excess fluid, the waste products, the extra salts and proteins and rubbish, and basically it's the sort of rubbish clearer of the tissues, and it carries it back via various lymph nodes where it's all cleaned and filtered and dumps that fluid back into the blood. And so that means there's a sort of constant flow of fluid from blood vessels on one side to the lymph vessels on the other. And this flow can be affected by various things. It's quite complex physiology, and this is one of the areas that medicine intervenes in quite a lot, because, for example, as I said before, the water is forced out from the blood capillaries by pressure. So if you have very high blood pressure, that's going to force out more water into the spaces between the cells. In some areas, that's really important. So in the kidneys, that's what forces water out of the blood that we don't need, and it becomes urine in the end. So if you don't have enough blood pressure in the kidneys, they can't do their job and they start to fail. So it's important to have some blood pressure, but very high blood pressure is no good, because it means that too much water is pushed out, and it's too difficult for any extra water that's not needed to get back into the capillaries. Hormones tend to affect this permeability of the blood vessels, and obviously your heart's health. So if your heart can't generate that pressure, if it's failing, we tend to see that it disturbs the fluid balance in our tissues, and people often get very swollen legs. It's also controlled, the blood pressure is also controlled by the diameter of the vessels. As some of you will know, if you take things like calcium channel blockers, I think amlodipine, is one of those, and it stops the blood vessels contracting, so it stops them raising blood pressure and things like that. The other important force in this sort of movement of fluid from the blood vessel to the lymphatic vessel is the fact that water tends to follow saltiness. So it will flow from an area that's where it's quite dilute to an area that's very salty. So, for example, we excrete salt in our sweat, or we excrete salt and then water follows, creating sweat. But in our bodies, that balance of saltiness will affect how much water is retained in our blood and how much is retained in our tissue fluid. And again, that's very much determined by hormones and the state of our kidneys and how much the salt balance that is maintained by our kidneys as well. So really, there's nothing I can tell you that is new or exciting here about how we regulate this, other than, you know, eating healthily, drinking plenty of water and all those sorts of things, healthy lifestyle, basically, exercise. So I'm going to sort of skip over that a little bit. Because actually this picture here should be much, much more complicated. And this is where it becomes a little bit more interesting to people who are movement therapists, people who are interested in how to physically manipulate fluid movements in their bodies themselves. Because actually this is the same sort of picture as I've just shown you, but it's got a few more details in it. That space between cells, that watery space, is actually not just a soup. It's actually full of fibers that are like bottle brushes. And those bottle brush fibers are very complex. They're very polarized, so they have lots of salts in them that attract water. So they sort of hold and draw water towards them. And that salt balance is maintained or controlled by the cells that are within that area. And what you can sort of see from this picture is that these meshy fibers, which extend not only from blood vessels walls to the lymphatic vessel walls, but they also attach to anchors in the membranes of the cells themselves. And within the cells themselves, there is also an internal mesh of fibers. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, because now we can see a connection that is body-wide. So these fibers are contained within connective tissue, which connect all sorts of body tissues, from muscles to bones to organs, and also connect every cell within that tissue as well. So connects to the internal mesh of each cell, and the internal mesh of each cell, the sort of warping and twisting and torsioning of that internal mesh actually also controls gene output and protein. It controls the function of the cell as well. So here we've got a direct physical handle on cellular function, and it's the cells themselves that also maintain this mesh. And this mesh, the pores within the mesh is, it's a bit like a sort of loofah. If you make the pores bigger, fluid can flow more quickly through that mesh. And if you make the pores smaller, and that you can do by increasing the hydration of the mesh, for example, then things like salts and hormones and growth factors and all those sorts of things, that's slowed down as it passes from the blood system to the lymphatic system. So by controlling this mesh, so what I should say is the mesh can control the cellular function. The cellular function can also control the mesh itself. And we can control the mesh by torsioning, tensioning, stretching, physically manipulating the mesh. And that in itself can then direct cellular growth or cellular function. So this is, and the cells can sense the state of this mesh. And a lot of the new research at the moment into cancer and why cancerous cells behave as they do, why they can spread so well, why they grow so quickly, and all that sort of thing. We're now beginning to understand that where they work very differently to normal cells is that they behave very differently with this mesh. And that's one of the things that can accelerate their spread and growth. It can also work the other way. It can it can slow down the passage of growth hormones or nutrients through the mesh, and you can end up cells becoming sort of hibernating or dormant as well. So when we grab a handful of muscle and massage it, or when we move our bodies, when we stretch, we tension that connecting tissue between all our organs and things, our sinews, our tendons, and all the rest of it, we are directly affecting this mesh. And I think that healthy movement that is slow and physiological movement, so not excessive stretching or excessive or repetitive stretching, but normal physiological movement, keeps these cells functioning in the way that they should be, and they maintain their mesh in a healthy way, and that allows healthy fluid flow from the blood system to the lymphatic system. So to summarize a little bit about all those extracellular fluids that we've talked about just now, and I'm going to talk about some of the other ones as well. We've talked a little bit about movement and massage and how that affects that mesh of extracellular structures. Ice and heat can also open and close blood vessels, and so encourage the movement of fluid through those tissues. And we use that a lot. If we've injured ourselves, you can reduce the blood flow to an area, so reduce its inflammation if you want to, or you can heat it up, bring more blood to an area to nourish it and relax it a little bit. Some of the other little things that we can think about here are on this picture. So the lymphatic system basically takes the waste products, the excess fluid from our extremities, from our tissues, and the legs essentially drain into this area called the thoracic duct, which you can see. I'm not sure I can point. I'd got myself in a mess last time I tried to point. But you can see where I've drawn that sort of green liver image on the image, and there's a sort of yellow line that extends from just below the liver, and it goes all the way up to these 2 points here, just under your collarbone. That structure is called the thoracic duct, and it's a massive lymphatic duct that drains your legs of all the lymph and all your abdomen as well. So that's really important, to get that fluid back out of those tissues, get it filtered, get it cleaned up, and then returned back into the blood system. And there's a little bit of evidence that when your blood is very acid, when your body is very acid, so if so things like sugar can make your body very acidic. that inhibits the little pulsations of that particular duct, that lymphatic duct called the thoracic duct, and so can reduce the return of lymph back into your blood system. The key drainage areas for the lymphatic system are things like your groin, so your inguinal areas on both sides where your stomach meet. I'm going to stand up and show you. You'll have to be able to admire my enormous maternal belly. You can see your groin is here. These are key drainage areas for your lymphatic fluid to come up from your legs and start to dive deep into your body cavity to join that thoracic duct. So sitting, like we're doing an awful lot of the time at the moment during lockdown, endless Zoom meetings, people aren't walking to work anymore, they're not getting up around in the office, you're folding up that inguinal area. So you're really inhibiting the lymphatic drainage from your legs. So stand up, move around, get that inguinal area opened up and moving. A lot of the lovely sort of yoga stretches that people do are the cobra, for example, or upward dog, I'm not quite sure what people call it. That's a really good way of opening out. The psoas stretches, where you put your back leg behind you and really open out the front of your body. Those sort of movements are really, really good to encourage drainage through that inguinal area to counteract all the time that we spend sitting. The next sort of barrier for that lymphatic fluid is, as I said, the thoracic duct. So we need to maintain a nice acid-base balance in our blood, not too much sugary stuff, not too much sitting in front of Netflix gobbling sweeties. And then up the thoracic duct, it drains back into our blood system just under our collarbones here. So sort of where your sternocleidomastoid muscles meet your collarbone, just in here under our shoulder blades, collarbones. So arm movements, again, are really, really important. Every time you move your arm around, you can see your collarbone moving around. And that's a really good way to keep this area, this drainage area for your lymphatic system open. And again, because we're all sitting in front of Zoom meetings all the time, it's cold and wintry, we're not going outside, we're not even waving at people anymore. We're getting very stagnant around this area as well. And that's where all the fluid drains down from our head as well. So it's a really important area to keep moving. A lot of us hold a lot of tension through our shoulders and our neck and our jaw. So that's another area that you can open up just by waggling your arms around a lot more, doing lots of nice big stretches. The diaphragm is another area that is really, really interesting because it sits between two compartments of our body. Sitting right above it, we have our heart, which that's obvious. We're going to talk about that in a bit as well. Actually attached to it, the heart's attached to the diaphragm, and the liver below is attached also to the heart. So as we use our diaphragm to breathe, we create negative pressure in our chest and positive pressure in our abdomen, and then vice versa as we breathe the other way. So it's like a pump, essentially. It pumps positive to negative as we breathe in and out. And that really helps draw blood up from our feet in our venous system and into the heart, and then helps it push back out again to the other way. So again, using our diaphragm is something we're not doing at the moment when we're spending so much time sitting indoors and not moving around. And if you look at countless ancient medical, but also sort of health lifestyle practices, they all involve breathing. Breathing is so core to so many movement practices and so many medical practices. So get that breathing going, get the diaphragm going, and that can help pull and push that fluid up and down between the two main compartments of our body, because the diaphragm does actually really sort of almost cut the body in half. The other thing that I haven't really talked about at all yet is the brain. So the brain also has a lymphatic system, which and that's very, very recently discovered. Until then, we knew we had this thing called CSF, which we thought probably behaved a bit like lymph. Cerebrospinal fluid is the long name for CSF. And it bathes, people thought basically it was a bit like amniotic fluid. The brain sort of floats in this bubble of cerebrospinal fluid. We've recently discovered that actually that's not the case. That cerebrospinal fluid behaves much more like lymph. It's in constant renewal, it's in constant flux. Not only does it bathe the brain, but it also penetrates through the brain tissue regularly, and it's constantly being renewed and flushed through. And it does eventually drain via lymphatics into the main body system, mainly through lymphatics of our nose and our neck. But one of the things that really drives its movement through the brain tissue, and this is possibly why we've not really noticed it properly before, apart from the fact that it's quite difficult to study because the walls have such thin vessels. The main flow of fluid through the brain tissue happens at night when we're sleeping. So if we don't sleep very much, the brain never really gets that chance to flush itself through and clean itself out, which may be one of the reasons why we feel tired. And it's also been shown that if we don't clean out the brain, flushing it with CSF nightly, these tangles of protein can build up, which are the tangles that we find in things like Alzheimer's disease. So that flushing through is really important to stop the brain becoming dysfunctional, really, and starting to deteriorate in diseases like dementia. So sleep, we need to be asleep for that to happen mainly. So getting enough sleep, we're slowly beginning to realise the importance of proper sleep. And again, during lockdown, lots of people watching way too much screen stuff, which really messes up with our circadian rhythm. So a lot of people are finding it difficult to sleep, and also because they're not physically tired, they haven't had enough exercise as well. So, which brings me to the last thing, which is exercise. Getting the heart pumping, getting that blood pressure flowing fast through our bodies is going to open up all the capillaries and access all those little nooks and crannies of our bodies that don't get accessed when we're just sitting there quietly all the time. So using your heart and actually increasing your heart rate a little bit every day is also good. But that's not news to anyone, I don't think. I've also put down eat bitter things occasionally, which might be a bit of a surprise to some people. And that's because bitterness can stimulate the production of digestive juices and saliva. And there's a little bit of research now looking into, nowadays we don't allow our vegetables to develop the bitter compounds because they're grown so fast. And people tend to go for sweet things. and that actually bitterness is important to get our digestive organs working quite hard, and that's important as part of our parasympathetic or our digestive relax and recuperate type of nervous system. It sort of tones our I'm eating and relaxing now, I'm not running about being stressed part of our nervous system, if that makes any sense. Okay, I think that is everything I want to say about that. Okay, so that takes us to a few of the other little areas that we haven't really mentioned before or yet about some of the other sort of areas of extracellular fluids. So as I said before, we find a lot of fluid locked up in things like cartilage and supportive gels. And this is a very sort of rough diagram of a generic joint, let's say. It's not very accurate anatomically, but doesn't really matter. Bone itself has quite a good blood supply, in fact, very good blood supply. And joints have generally a sort of membrane around them that also has a good blood supply. And that blood supply is what produces the fluid within the joints called synovial fluid. And that synovial fluid essentially contains lots of nutrients and lubricating molecules for the joint itself. Now, cartilage itself, which is the very, very shiny, if you eat meat, you'll see at the end of the bones of meat that you eat, a very shiny white surface, and it's incredibly smooth. So cartilage is what allows joints to glide over each other without friction. But cartilage doesn't have a blood supply, and the obvious reason for that is because it's constantly being stretched and compressed, and it's being badly treated basically, and blood vessels just wouldn't survive in the amount of pressure that cartilage is under. So cartilage needs to get its nutrition from elsewhere, and some of it can be nourished on the sort of bony side by nutrients diffusing through from the bone, which has a good blood supply. But the side that contacts the cartilage on the other bone, that doesn't get as far as that basically, because it's quite dense stuff. So that cartilage really does need to be nourished in another way. And the synovial fluid that is produced by the membranes around a joint washes over the surface of the joint. But more importantly, as we move that joint, that squishes it literally physically forces the fluid into the cartilage matrix itself. So it actually squashes it in there so it can nourish those little cartilage cells, and they can slowly repair and replenish any damage that has been done. And if you have a joint that is static and you just compress it, eventually the synovial fluid is just squished out to either side, and there isn't any left to be squished into the cartilage itself. So a statically loaded joint doesn't really get any nutrition. Whereas if you load a joint but keep it moving, it's all those soup moolies, you know, you actually constantly squeezing that fluid into the cartilage itself, and therefore nourishing it. So as osteopaths, we're always told to, if the cartilage in a joint is degrading, you need to keep it moving. You need to keep it gently moving, not necessarily weight-bearing movement, because sometimes that can be too painful if the cartilage is too worn away, and can also add extra load and work on the cartilage. But more and more now, when you look at traditional therapy in, you know, NHS therapy and all the rest of it, they tell you to move joints now, not to go and rest in bed for weeks and weeks. Most joints respond better and heal more quickly if you move them. And that's because that is distributing that fluid into the cartilage. Now, some joints, and this is where this is very anatomically incorrect, also have discs. And discs are basically very fibrous, meshy structures and incredibly salty inside as well. So they tend to suck water into them. And so if we look at the discs in our spine, for example, during the day, when we're standing up and walking around, we squash those fibrous cushions basically, and we squash the water out. And that's why when we get up in the morning, we're actually generally a couple of centimeters taller than we are at night. And you might find that some of your yoga moves where you sort of really curl up and compress those discs, you can't really reach your toes, or you can't do that full forwards bend. Whereas if you did that same movement in the evening, you'd get much further. And that's because as the day progresses, the body weight pushes the water out of the disc and pushes at any dissolved waste materials or anything like that as well. And then when you lie flat and go to sleep, then you're not weight bearing anymore, and the saltiness sucks the fluid back in again. That sucking of fluid in also carries in any nutrients that the few cells that live within the disc need. They're very sort of low maintenance. They're very slow growing. They hardly do anything except just repair stuff as needed. So that's probably just enough that they need, that diurnal sucking in, pushing out, sucking in, pushing out. So again, if you don't get up and walk about, those discs are not going to get the in-out movement. They're just going to fill up, but there's no way to get rid of their waste. So another reason why we need to be moving around up and down and keeping those that fluid movement going in and out to nourish the cells in our disc. Okay, I think that's all I need to say on that. So last of all, we've got lots of fluid-filled organs in our body as well. This is a sort of branch that we talk about in osteopathy as being visceral osteopathy, which some people specialize in and are very competent at. I personally don't use it that much, but I think it's really, really interesting. And also, this is encompassing a lot of the other stuff that we see, a lot of other movement therapies as well. So I'll start with some of the sort of interesting anatomical features. So the liver and the bladder, and this stems back to embryology. The umbilicus, or a tummy button, where the umbilical cord goes in. If you remember, the umbilical cord carries blood to and from the mother. So it needs a sort of direct route into the body, basically. And when we are born and the cord is cut and we start breathing, we don't need that anymore. And the sort of remnants of those channels shrivel up and just become ligaments. But the ligaments are pretty tough. You can really give them a good old yank and they will move internal organs. So there's a ligament that goes from the umbilicus, and it was actually the original shortcut to the heart, carrying oxygenated blood, goes from the umbilicus, your tummy button, to the liver itself, and goes right through the liver to the blood vessels right behind it. So it actually sort of almost chops the liver in half. It's called the falciform ligament. So you can directly manipulate the liver, which is chock full of blood, and it's full of, it's like a sponge with enormous holes that filters and checks over your blood and stores the excess fat and releases extra sugars and all those sorts of things. You can access that and manipulate it through that ligament that comes to your tummy button. And then there's also one that goes down towards your bladder and sort of hooks it up slightly. I sometimes find that if I have had a very full bladder and I've been absolutely bursting for the loo, and then I go and sit on the loo and have a massive pee, I get this excruciating pain pulling up to my tummy button because my bladder has shrunk so quickly, and it's really yanked on that median umbilical ligament. And I have to sort of like grab my tummy button and waggle it around a little bit to release that discomfort. But again, bladder, so people who have chronic cystitis, irritable bladder, those sorts of things, visceral osteopaths will sometimes use the median umbilical ligament to access the bladder. So another fluid-filled organ. Also sitting under the diaphragm. Sorry, and I should say the liver is actually attached to the diaphragm as well. So clearly breathing exercises, but also using the diaphragm in movement will affect the fluid content, will basically massage and squeeze and pump the liver. Sitting just off to the left of the liver, right at the back, just under the ribs on the left-hand side at the back, is the spleen, which again is another enormously fluid-filled organ. It's full of blood. A ruptured spleen in a motorcycle accident is you know, most people are lucky to survive that because there's so much blood in the spleen that they suffer massive hemorrhages internally. It's also a useful storage of blood. So if you go into shock, so if you cut a big artery somewhere or something, the spleen can actually contract and push more blood into the system if it's spilling out somewhere, if it gets low volume. So the spleen is really a reservoir of blood. It's really important in our immune system, and it's also involved in our stress response. And again, sits right under the diaphragm, so can be manipulated and massaged by breathing, by using those low ribs. And that's sort of going to bring me slightly to the thought about, so you can see down in the sort of bottom of this slide, I've done a sort of picture of a pink balloon that's been trapped between other structures. So a lot of our body is considered to be a tensegrity structure, which is a various sort of struts that are not if you take our skeleton, for example, and just take the bones and things, it doesn't actually have any structural stability. It's the connection between all those rigid struts by more elastic parts, and also the turgidity created by the fluid-filled organs that gives us a lot of structural support. So, for example, you know, a typical example of how we would use turgidity in our body tissues to give us structural support is an erection. You know, when a penis fills with blood, it becomes quite hard and erect. When the blood goes, then it's floppy and soft. The same could apply to pregnancy. It's thought that the amniotic fluid gives the woman's body a little bit more structural support, so she's better able to manage the extra weight and things. Sometimes that extra fluid build up in the pregnant body can be a problem, because you get things like carpal tunnel syndrome and all sorts of swollen legs and all that sort of stuff. But one of the ways we think our spinal muscles work, the ones that run down either side of your spine, is by using a sort of hydraulic system almost. So pumping those muscles full of fluid or blood gives them stability. There's lots of examples in the body where we use the fluid-filled organs to give us structure. And plants do the same, you know, and when they don't have enough fluid in their cells, they wilt. So maintaining that level of hydration is important, but also you can manipulate within that structure by moving the structure itself. So in the case of the spleen and the liver, it would be the surrounding struts, the ribs and things like that. And the other thing that we can see here, which I can't because it's covered up, is as I said before, the heart and the liver are attached to the diaphragm physically. So again, using the diaphragm will lift and depress the heart and the liver alternately, and that will pump fluid or help pump blood in and out of those organs. I think that's everything I want to say there. Okay, I think I might have finished a little bit early, but thank you all very much for listening. Stop screen share. Hello. And I'm going to ask Danny how I do this.
Hello.
Hi. I'm not quite sure if I unmute everyone, is there just going to be complete chaos? Or
I don't know. Let's find out. I don't think chaos.
Sure if I can allow people to unmute themselves.
People can unmute themselves, yeah. So,
okay. Yeah. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, do feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. I'll also try and I can see the chat now. So if you want to write something in the chat. Oh, someone's written stomach acid as well. Excellent secretions. I'll do my best to answer them. But thank you very much for listening. And do please go and check out all the amazing movement classes and therapies that you can do at Brighton Natural Health Centre. So there's Qigong, there's Laurie Booth's movement classes, I can't remember what he calls them now. There's yoga and Pilates and all sorts of fantastic things to counteract all this stagnation that we're getting with our sitting around in the dreaded lockdown, which looks like it's going to continue. Movement for Health with Laurie, brilliant. Okay. Thank you. Has anyone done any of Laurie's courses? I think I've done one or two. It's really quite, it's lovely to explore your body and really feel you're moving bits that you had forgotten how to move. Okay. Oh, are there any types of self-massage that you would recommend? So self-massage in terms of, yes, absolutely. I think to help with your lymphatic drainage, you can massage up your legs into your groin area ensuring that your groin is nice and stretched out. You can breathe and help that fluid move around your abdomen by just massaging your own abdomen, and also really important around your neck to help that CSF drain down into your collarbone area, particularly if you are the sort of person that holds a lot of tension in your neck. And how do you improve body flow as a chiropractor? That's interesting. I'm not a chiropractor, so I don't know. I'm sure they have lots of very similar techniques to the ones that we use as osteopaths. So I think they tend to do a little bit more spinal manipulation, but that is often aimed at improving movement of the back or the trunk. So that's going to help fluid distribution. I don't know if they do as much sort of soft tissue work as osteopaths do. What do I think about the value of glucosamine for joint issues? That's an interesting one. Glucosamine was all the rage a while ago, even that it was actually prescribed on the NHS for a while. I think you have to take quite a high dose of it. I can't remember what it is at the moment, for it actually to reach the effect that it seemed to be therapeutic. I think in the end, the NHS said it's not cost effective. Some people do find it quite useful. Glucosamine is actually a building block for that mesh that creates the gel of the cartilage. So if you think you're not getting enough glucosamine, which is an amino acid, it's a protein breakdown thing in your diet, then you might be giving your cells the building blocks to make the mesh that creates cartilage. But if your cells aren't working very well, then they're not going to turn that extra glucosamine into cartilage. So probably not going to be of much value there. You've still got to get it into those cartilage cells. So you've still got to move the joint a little bit under compression. Having said that, some people swear by it. My father swears by it, but lots of people find it's not really any good and it can be a waste of money. It's very expensive if you're going to take it at the proper dose. So I would say eat proper food and gently move your joints better. Oh, PMC, how do you improve body fluid flow as a chiropractor? As an osteopath, we encourage people to move, basically. We encourage people not to be frightened of movement. So pain can frighten people into not moving, and often that is the worst thing for them. So often it's showing people that it is possible to move painlessly, and that movement won't damage whatever they've come to see us about. We do lots of soft tissue work, which helps to redistribute fluid. We open drainage channels. As I say, some osteopaths do visceral osteopathy, where they manipulate the organs like the liver and things like that. I would say I tend to work mainly on lymphatics and massage, soft tissue massage, really, to try and get areas moving again, get the muscles more relaxed so that they can move the joints better. I think that's, have I missed any questions? Okay. Dry skin brushing. So dry skin brushing is, I think, thought to be a sort of almost a lymphatic thing. It encourages lymph to move around more. There are, I believe, I've not done a course in it or anything like that, but I believe there's quite specific directions that you want to be brushing in. And I think those brushings are directed at moving lymph towards the core, so up your legs basically into your inguinal area and up through to your diaphragm and up your arms into your clavicular area. Obviously, what you've got to think about if you're moving any lymph first is actually you've got to work backwards. You need to empty the plug hole before you drain the sink. So you want to start brushing up here and waggling your arms around and then brushing the lymph into those open plug holes. There's no point just brushing lymph towards a closed plug hole. And the same applies for your groin area. You want to get your diaphragm moving, open this plug hole, which is the final plug hole, get your diaphragm moving, get your groin area moving, waggle your legs around, straighten out, and then start brushing your legs, brushing the lymph back up towards your trunk. How is what an osteopath does different to having a massage? It can be incredibly similar. The overlap between osteopaths, masseuses and chiropractors is huge. Some osteopaths pretty much only massage. Other osteopaths will pretty much only manipulate. It depends who you see and what their intention is. And also most osteopaths will tailor their treatment to their patient. So some people it's not appropriate to manipulate them, so you would just massage them. Perhaps the massage techniques that osteopaths use are very different to like a hot stone massage or a beauty massage, which is aimed at being very sort of relaxing, whereas osteopaths tend to get their fingers and bony bits in a little bit more, and it can be a bit more painful probably, because we're trying to physically change some of the soft tissues. I don't know if that answers your question, Fiona. Okay. Oh, Danny's saying something, but I can't hear.
I'll unmute myself. Thank you so much, Amy. That was really interesting. Thank you.
It's been a long time. I've been stuck at home on this maternity leave for 2 months now, and I don't think I've spoken to anyone, let alone 30 people. So it's been a bit weird to actually talk for this long at once.